Welcome back. This is Module 2 of our board orientation, talking about privilege, oppression, isms, implicit bias, and intersectionality. Our goals for today are to explore these concepts, understand the various concepts of power, privilege, oppression, power, prejudice, and race, and their relationship to isms. Understand the 4 types. I've got racism here, but it's really the 4 different types of oppression. Identify the impact of implicit bias and gain a shared understanding of intersectionality. So let's start by talking about privilege and oppression. Concepts of privilege and oppression are foundations of understanding equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's important to note that to be privileged or oppressed are not value judgments or character assessments, although for many, many people, strong feelings get conjured up when they hear the word privileged. Privilege and oppression each reflect the ways that groups of people experience society. Privilege is when one group has something of value that is denied to others simply because of the groups that they belong to, rather than because of anything that they have done or failed to do. Dominant group members may be unaware of their privilege or take it for granted. It's often uncomfortable to talk about privilege. People often feel it's an indictment of our character or dismissing our hard work and effort. However, that's not what privilege is about. It really is about recognizing ways that we have had opportunities and have been closed to others at a systems level. I want to say again, privilege and oppression are created at the systems level by things like public policies and private actions. That means there's no shame or blame in privilege or oppression. It doesn't mean that you as an individual haven't worked hard or experienced hardship. But it is important to recognize how these function so that we can avoid reinforcing them with our decisions, behaviors, and actions. So let's talk about oppression. Oppression is the systematic targeting or marginalization of one group by a more powerful group for the social, economic, and political benefit of the more powerful group. We talk about marginalized groups or oppressed groups, and more frequently, I've heard the term of historically underrepresented groups. All of these are the same, talking about the same thing. So to demonstrate this, think about being on an escalator. Imagine that you are on the escalator, and when we experience privilege, it's like we just step onto an up escalator and it takes us all the way to the top. We don't really have to do anything. It just takes us there by virtue of the fact that we stepped onto the privilege escalator. If we walk or run up that escalator, we'll get to the top even faster. If you are experiencing oppression, it's like trying to walk up an escalator on the down escalator side. If you just stand there, it continues to go down. If you're going to try to get to the top, you need to run as fast as you can. You cannot afford to rest or slow down. So you are really fighting that uphill battle. It is possible to experience both privilege and oppression depending on the circumstances. Consider a top, let's just say there's a top neurosurgeon in your area. He's world renowned for groundbreaking research on specific types of brain cancers. He's well respected and enjoys a variety of privileges within the healthcare system, productivity bonuses, sitting on the executive committee for the medical staff, etc. He's also a Black neurosurgeon. When this neurosurgeon gets in his beautiful black Mercedes and drives out of the hospital parking lot at night, he becomes an adult Black male driving a car. When he gets pulled over because his taillight is out, he knows that he must have his license and registration on the dashboard and his hands visible on the steering wheel and be as cooperative with the police as possible so that he doesn't get in trouble for driving while Black. Consider your own experiences. Are there areas where you've experienced both privilege or oppression? It's entirely possible and is entirely likely. So now we're going to talk about isms. So power, it's really important to talk about power. And when we talk about isms, we have to start with power. So power is the access to resources and decision makers, as well as the ability to influence others and to define your reality for yourself and for others. That define reality for yourself and others is part of the definition that we need to focus on. So let's explore. This is Ronnie and Kobe. They live in Texas. Ronnie at the time was a PhD candidate and Toby was in middle school or high school, I guess. In 2015, he was working on his 9th grade social studies homework and they were doing a unit on migration. He opened up his textbook and found an image of the southeastern United States, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida. And on that page was a call out and it said, and I quote, "The Atlantic slave trade between the 1500s and the 1800s brought millions of workers from Africa to the southern United States to work on agricultural plantations." Let me read that again. The Atlantic slave trade between the 1500s and the 1800s brought millions of workers from Africa to the southern United States to work on agricultural plantations. What's wrong with that? You can perceive that image. What's wrong with that? What does worker imply? It implies that people had choice, that it was voluntary, and that they were paid a wage. Calling slaves workers implies that they earned a wage and moreover ignores the fact that people were taken against their will, tortured, raped, killed, and torn from their families. Who brought them here? This text says that the slave trade brought them here. No Europeans, colonists, or people were named. It removes the agency and accountability by not naming the slave traders as Europeans or colonists. Do you think this wording was an accident? How many people had to review this text prior to publication? Think about how many textbooks this is in or was in, and how many children learned this. This is the ability to define reality for generations of school children. What makes it even more difficult is that Texas and California have such huge child populations that what makes it into their textbook often sets the standard for textbooks across the country. Ronnie posted the image online, which went viral, and the textbook publisher did end up responding. They have since issued stickers to correct existing textbooks. and had to plan to republish the revised books much sooner than they thought. Okay, so they provided a sticker to folks that had the textbooks, and then the teachers or students were supposed to put the sticker in the right place. Well, let's talk about prejudice. Prejudice is a judgment or opinion, usually, but not always negative, and it's formed on insufficient grounds before facts are known or in disregard of facts that contradict it. Having prejudices is a part of being human. We all have them. It's actually part of our biological survival instinct. We make snap judgments all the time about people to keep us safe. Is this person a friend or a foe? Are we going to be safe or not? So we've got power, defining reality. We've got prejudice. So what results are isms? Isms are a combination of prejudice and the misuse of power in systems and institutions. They're systems of privilege and oppression based on social identities and rooted in doctrines of superiority and inferiority. They are not discrete and are experienced in interlocking and overlapping ways. All isms are about the misuse or use of power, which may be intentional, or it may be a lack of action when you have an opportunity to use power to create more equity. You can use this equation as a blueprint for how all isms function. Racism is about race prejudice plus the misuse of power. Sexism, ageism, ableism, heterosexism, classism, elitism, they all work the same way. Prejudice, misuse of power creates the ism. It's important to recognize that nearly all of us belong to at least one group that experiences privilege or oppression at a systems level, even if we don't feel like we have personally benefited or been discriminated against. Finally, there's a caveat to this. These experiences and identities aren't discrete. You can't say be privileged in 5 areas and oppressed in 5 areas, so great it all evens out. It's important to recognize that people's experiences are more complex than an equation. So I'm going to talk about the levels of oppression, but I'm going to use racism as an example of how they work because it's the most obvious that we have in society. But before I do, I just need to define race for us. This discussion is based on how we define race in the US. It may or may not be the same in other countries. So back in the 1700s and 1800s, scientists began naming and classifying all living things. Carl Linnaeus from biology class, remember him? Had kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. I'll never remember all of those. In the 1800s, scientists were studying differences in humans, and in particular, Samuel Morton, who was a physician from Philadelphia, decided to measure skull capacities from skeletons. So how big was our skull? Because certainly, if our skull is bigger, we must be more intelligent. He paid grave robbers and bought skulls from people of different races. So like I said, he measured the volume of the skulls to determine how big the brains were, and he equated bigger brains with more intelligence, which we know that is not how it works. In his study, Morton ranked Europeans as the most intelligent and the pinnacle of humankind. That was followed by the Chinese. The third was Southeast Asians and Polynesians. Fourth were American Indians, and the smallest brain capacity was assigned to Africans and Australian Aborigines. So when we talk about the levels of oppression, we're talking about, in this case, racism, but you can take any ism that's up there. We use, there's 4 distinct types of oppression. Remember, in each of these, we are looking at the power dynamics involved between the group that experiences privilege and the group that experiences oppression. So first we have internal racism, the set of private beliefs, prejudices, and ideas that individuals have about the superiority of the white people and the inferiority of the people of color that can show up in conscious and unconscious behaviors and actions. These beliefs can be held by people of any race because we have internalized their cultural messages. When we move, excuse me, to the next level of interpersonal racism, this is the expression of racism between individuals. This is usually the way we think about racism when people have hatred or bias against another group that they believe is inferior. Oftentimes we think about this as being very overt, but it can also operate as silence. An example of this can occur when you are present when someone tells a racist joke and you know that you could speak up, but you choose not to. Institutionalized racism is discriminatory treatment, unfair policies and practices, inequitable opportunities, and impacts within organizations and institutions based on race. Institutions can be places like schools, courts, churches, etc. Structural racism is racial bias across institutions and society. It's the cumulative and compound effects of an array of factors, such as public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms that work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial inequity. Remember, you can replace racism with any other ism and it would still hold true. For example, structural ageism can show up through public policies, through institutional practices, and cultural representations that perpetuate age inequities. Let's move on and talk about implicit bias. Attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. These biases, which encompass both favorable and unfavorable assessments, are activated involuntarily. Let me repeat, these are involuntarily and without an individual's awareness or intentional control. So what you're going to see next is a short clip from Brene Myers. Brene is a diversity advocate who gives a great example of what unconscious or implicit bias can look like.
It's number one, we got to get out of denial. We don't need, stop trying to be good people. We need real people. You know, I do a lot of diversity work and people will come up to me at the beginning of a workshop. They're like, oh, Miss Diversity Lady, we're so glad you're here. But we don't have a bias bone in our body. And I'm like, really? Because I do this work every day and I see all my biases. I mean, not too long ago, I was on a plane and I heard the voice of a woman from Women Poly coming over the PA system, and I was just like so excited. I was so thrilled. I was like, yes, women, we are rocking it. We are now in the stratosphere, you know? It was all good, and then it started getting turbulent and bumpy, and I was like, I hope she can drive. I know, right, but it is not even like I knew that was a bias until I was coming back on the other leg, and there's always a guy driving, and it's often turbulent and bumpy, and I've never questioned the competence of the male driver. The pilot, it's good. Now here's the problem. It's like if you ask me explicitly, I would say female pilot, awesome. But it appears that when things get funky and a little troublesome, a little risky, I lean on a bias that I didn't even know that I had. You know, fast moving planes in the sky, I want a guy. That's my default. Men are my default. Who is your default? Who do you trust? Who are you afraid of? Who do you implicitly feel connected to? Who do you run away from? I'm going to tell you what we have learned. The implicit association test, which measures unconscious bias. You can go online and take it. 5 million people have taken it. Turns out our default is white. We like white people. We prefer white. What do I mean by that? When people are shown images of black men and white men, we are more quickly able to associate that picture with a positive word, that white person with a positive word, than we are when we are trying to associate positive with a black face. And vice versa. When we see a black face, it's easier for us to connect black with negative than it is white with negative. 70% of white people taking that test prefer white. 50% of black people taking that test prefer white.
There has been a lot of research about this in the last decade or so. An important concept of implicit or unconscious bias is that it's not necessarily that we have hatred or negative feelings for people who aren't like us, our out group, that leads to decisions. It's often more about preferences for people that look like us or act like us. Our in-group preferences are more common than our out-group hatred. So let me say that again. It's our in-group, people that look like us that we seem affiliated with, that are more common, and our preferences for those people are more common than those who are not like us, our out group, and any negative feelings that we have about them. It's these preferences that over time can lead to advantage. So think about what happens when you add power to unconscious bias. So let's say I was hiring for a position, and the first person I thought of was my friend Karen. I feel a connection. They do things just like I do, or she does things just like I do. We get each other. I never even think to tell the HR folks that I do know someone else. Now I need to start that one over. So the work on implicit bias and this important topic, or unconscious bias, has become a very important topic in the field. And there's been a great amount of research done on this. So an important concept of unconscious bias is that it's not necessarily that we have negative perceptions about people who aren't like us that lead to decisions. It's more often that we have a preference for people that look like us, or our in-group preferences that are more common than our out-group hatred that leads to those decisions. And it's those preferences that over time can accumulate to advantage. So think about what happens when you add power to an unconscious bias. Say I was looking for a new staff member, and I had two candidates. And the first candidate looked like my best friend. That person that I was thinking of thinks similar to me, has a similar work ethic. We share common values and beliefs. And the other candidate is from a different country, does not look like me, has really great resume on paper, but I don't have a close affinity for that individual. So when those unconscious biases reinforce privilege and oppression at a systems level, then we're contributing in another way to the isms that we experience in society. So how can we address implicit bias? So some of the ways that we can do that, and just to become more aware, is that recognizing bias is normal. It's a really important effort to really develop the ability to observe yourself. Can you see when you are maybe engaging with a bias that you didn't even realize, like Renee said, that you had? Practice constructive uncertainty. And what do we mean by that? Don't take yourself as the arbiter of truth. You become curious. Become curious about, well, is there another way of looking at this? And know that as you're doing that, it's going to be awkward. So embrace the awkwardness. Embrace the vulnerable part of yourself and allow that to come through and be awkward. Engage with people in groups that you don't know very well. This is part of when we talk about diversity on the board. Who is our group of friends, and do they all look like us? How are we lifting people up who may be well positioned to be in a leadership position, but we just don't know them? And embrace feedback and data whenever possible. So we know that we are a very feedback rich organization, but really take that in. Not all of it's going to be right, but there may be nuggets of truth in there that you have to be vulnerable to explore. So let's move on to intersectionality. Intersectionality is a term that's new to many people. We've been talking about isms and privilege and oppression that can come along with them. While it's easy to think about these things as very discrete issues that can be addressed individually, we know that that just isn't the case. So that's where our last definition comes in. Intersectionality is the interaction between gender, race, and many other categories of differences in individual lives, social practices, institutional arrangements, and cultural ideologies, and the outcomes of these interactions in terms of power. The term intersectionality was coined by a lawyer, feminist, and scholar, Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, and in 1989, and it has become a critical concept for people engaged in EDI work. Another way to think about this is the interaction of multiple identities and experiences of exclusion and subordination. The idea is that we can't separate ourselves from our different identities. I can't separate that I'm white and a female and tell you which is more important. They intersect in a variety of ways, and that's what creates our uniqueness. So let's take a look at a fun way of, and a more accessible way of looking at this issue. So meet Bob. Bob is a stripy blue triangle, a little sassy, but he just had a great life. But he just moved from his neighborhood where there were many other stripy triangles. And he loves being a stripy blue triangle. It's very important to him. In this new neighborhood, some people don't like Bob. He faces oppression because he's both a triangle and he's stripy. There are affinity groups for both stripes and for triangles. So he could join a group for triangles and he could join a group for stripes. But those two groups don't talk to each other. And in fact, they often fight for resources and the same resources. But he doesn't know where to go. It's difficult. He doesn't know if he's more stripy or more of a triangle, and wishes that the groups would work in an intersectional way. We must recognize that oppressions are not isolated, and intersectionality is necessary to achieve equity. Intersectionality is the belief that oppressions are interlinked and cannot be solved alone. So next up, we're going to hear from Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw and about intersectionality and what led her to come up with this term.
Many years ago, I began to use the term intersectionality to deal with the fact that many of our social justice problems like racism and sexism are often overlapping, creating multiple levels of social injustice. Now, the experience that gave rise to intersectionality was my chance encounter with a woman named Emma DeGraffenreid. Emma DeGraffenreid was an African-American woman, a working wife, and a mother. I actually read about Emma's story from the pages of a legal opinion, written by a judge who had dismissed Emma's claim of race and gender discrimination against a local car manufacturing plant. Emma, like so many African American women, sought better employment for her family and for others. She wanted to create a better life for her children and for her family. But she applied for a job and she was not hired, and she believed that she was not hired because she was a black woman. Now, the judge in question dismissed Emma's suit. And the argument for dismissing the suit was that the employer did hire African Americans and the employer hired women. The real problem, though, that the judge was not willing to acknowledge was what Emma was actually trying to say. That the African Americans that were hired, usually for industrial jobs, maintenance jobs, were all men. And the women that were hired, usually for secretarial or front office work, were all white. Only if the court was able to see how these policies came together would he be able to see the double discrimination that Emma DeGraffenreid was facing. But the court refused to allow Emma to put two causes of action together to tell her story because he believed that by allowing her to do that, she would be able to have preferential treatment. She'd have an advantage by being able to have two swings at the bat when African American men and white women only had one swing at the bat. But of course, neither African American men or white women needed to combine a race and gender discrimination claim to tell the story of the discrimination they were experiencing. Why wasn't the real unfairness law's refusal to protect African American women simply because their experiences weren't exactly the same as white women and African American men? Rather than broadening the frame to include African American women, the court simply tossed their case completely out of court. Now, as a student of anti-discrimination law, as a feminist, as an anti-racist, I was struck by this case. It felt to me like injustice squared. So first of all, black women weren't allowed to work at the plant. Second of all, the court doubled down on this exclusion by making it legally inconsequential. And to boot, there was no name for this problem. And we all know that where there's no name for a problem, you can't see a problem. And when you can't see a problem, you pretty much can't solve it. Many years later, I'd come to recognize that the problem that Emma was facing was a framing problem. The frame that the court was using to see gender discrimination or to see race discrimination was partial and it was distorting. For me, the challenge that I faced was trying to figure out whether there was an alternative narrative, a prism that would allow us to see Emma's dilemma, a prism that would allow us to rescue her from the cracks in the law, that would allow judges to see her story. So it occurred to me, maybe a simple analogy to an intersection might allow judges to better see Emma's dilemma. So if we think about this intersection, the roads to the intersection would be the way that the workforce was structured by race and by gender. And then the traffic in those roads would be the hiring policies and the other practices that ran through those roads. Now, because Emma was both Black and female, she was positioned precisely where those roads overlapped, experiencing the simultaneous impact of the company's gender and race traffic. The law was like that ambulance that shows up and is ready to treat Emma only if it can be shown that she was harmed on the race road or on the gender road, but not where those roads intersected. So, what do you call being impacted by multiple forces and then abandoned to fend for yourself? Intersectionality seemed to do it for me.
So that's the end of this module, which is the longest one in the series of 4. Next up, we're going to talk about how do we apply an equity lens to our work. Thank you so much.